In a time of profound social and cultural change, an entire generation of young Americans stood united in their desire for more powerful cars, fueling the greatest horsepower war in automotive history. Screeching rubber through turns, roaring down back streets and country lanes, with fun-loving drivers and their wild and powerful dream machines. Just about anyone could afford to fly down the road in a boldly styled, attention-grabbing American icon, the muscle car. Hello, I'm Chip Foose, coming to you from Day Family Classic Cars in Corona, California. It's said that all good things must come to an end. Muscle cars have been sales leaders and publicity machines for American auto manufacturers. But with insane horsepower and jaw-dropping torque came increased scrutiny and ruinous insurance rates. Chronic underreporting of engine power combined with highway safety issues led to a backlash against the idea of signing over a 400-plus horsepower machine to a teenager. The decline began with GM, and in just a few short years, all of Detroit's muscle cars would fade into history.
What happened in '71 is that the government had really aggressively pushed what we call low-lead gasoline, and General Motors, to cooperate with it, cut the compression in every one of their cars. Chevrolet right on up through Cadillac to 8.75 to 1 to accommodate this lesser quality gasoline.
These two automobile engines look pretty much the same, but they certainly don't act the same. The one on the right is standard in this new Buick. It's designed to run on low-lead or no-lead gasoline. It can significantly help cut exhaust emissions that pollute the air.
Here we've been running now 10.5, 10 3/4, and a couple cases way over 11 to 1 compression. And that low-lead fuel didn't want to work in those engines very well.
Help us fight pollution now while we look for better answers. 1971 Buick, something to believe in.
In order to be compatible with the government's intention to get lead out of gasoline for emissions reasons, GM took a bold step and cooperated. Now, Ford didn't do it until 1972, nor did Chrysler. But by that time, the muscle car really had seriously disappeared as an important segment in the market.
It's worth remembering that the vast majority of cars sold during this period weren't stoplight-to-stoplight racers, and even most muscle cars were fairly tame compared to the rare and exotic machines that we've profiled on this show. This 1970 Dodge Challenger RT is a perfect example of the sort of pre-decline muscle car that would appeal to a more broad segment of the population than a car that emphasized tire smoke over a smooth ride. Dressed in one of Mopar's celebrated impact colors, plum crazy purple with white racing stripes, this Challenger is powered by a 383 cubic inch, 335 horsepower V8 with an Edelbrock manifold. It also features hood scoops, rally instrument cluster, white bucket seats, and an optional center console shifted torque flight automatic. This Challenger is but one of the many cars on display at the Wellborn Muscle Car Museum, one of the country's premier muscle car collections, along with signage and ephemera from the period. As you might imagine, for Tim Wellborn, it's like the muscle car era never ended.
We just love cars, my wife and I both, Pam. So we began collecting well over 30 years ago, and we put together mostly a Mopar collection up until about 8 years ago, and then we began collecting other cars with the envision that we would someday have a muscle car museum. And this old building that we're in was a Chevrolet Buick dealership back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, 2 blocks from our home, so I kind of got the ultimate garage and decided this is a great place for a museum. The real core of my collection is Chargers, and a lot of times I'm asked, why do I have so many Chargers? Because I have one of every year from 1966 forward. And the reason that the Charger is special to me, my father had one, and I have kept it through the years, but every car is different. You would find pretty much a big horse version of every mid-size car that was roaming the streets in 1970. I've got a Ram Air 4 Pontiac GTO Judge convertible, 4-speed, awesome running, awesome sounding car. We have an LS6 triple black Survivor. We have a Boss 429 with 4,000 miles on it. A W30 442 convertible that is really a fun one to drive too. The way that we put together the collection was years 1969, 1970, 1971, which I consider is the very pinnacle of the muscle car era. That's when you had all the biggest of the engines, the Hurst 4-speed shifters, the scoops on the hood, all the stripes, all the wild colors came during that era, and then it abruptly ended in 1971. So we're focused on the very top years of the muscle cars here and the latter waning years of it.
Coming up, the police get their own muscle.
The state trooper version here in Alabama had the 401, and there are many cases where they had chased down 454s and 440 Magnums with this car at better than 150 miles per hour.
By 1971, the muscle car party was nearly over. Most of the major car companies had begun the long process of detuning their cars. But there were still glimmers of light for the horsepower obsessed. A few cars managed to slip through the cracks and carry the muscle car flag, cloaked as high-speed pursuit cars for law enforcement or as pace cars for major automobile races. While the general public was powering down, these cars would remind us that Detroit still had the muscle to keep the good times rolling. Despite producing a few notable cars in the era, American Motors remains overlooked in the history of muscle cars. But 1971 would see their most impressive offering yet, a car powerful enough to chase down almost anything on the road, the 401 Javelin.
The AMC also was a car that you may have thought wasn't a strong performer when you compare it to a 454 or a 440 Magnum or whatever. It'll fool you. The state trooper version here in Alabama had the 401, and there are many reported cases where they had chased down 454s and 440 Magnums with this car at better than 150 miles per hour.
The cars delivered to the Alabama Department of Public Safety were powered by fleet service versions of AMC's 401 4-barrel V8. The car also featured an integral roof spoiler and revised front fenders reminiscent of a contemporary Corvette. But despite the ample get-up-and-go on display, AMC built relatively few Javelins.
In fact, if I'm not wrong, there were only a little over 4,000 of them ever built. So today in the collector world, they're rarer than pretty much anything that you're going to come across. And they're also extremely hard to restore because there were so few parts for them, and the reproduction parts have not really followed the car. So to find a good example is truly a treat.
By the next year, 1972, practically every muscle car model had been subjected to lower compression and decreased horsepower. But the partnership between Oldsmobile and Hurst Performance, which had been responsible for several iconic muscle cars, still had enough juice to deliver one last hurrah, thanks in part to the Indy 500.
There was an accident in 1971 at the track. The 71 Challenger crashed at the end of the pace lap.
The pace car is under control. The race is underway, but all eyes are on the photographer's stand at the foot of the straightaway. An unprecedented accident, and miraculously, no one fatally injured.
The next year after, none of the big three really wanted to do anything about the Indy pace. So Hurst basically said, okay, I'll build you something, but I'm going to use an Oldsmobile. And they came up with the 72 Hurst Olds. The convertible was the pace car.
This marked the first time an Indy pace car was sponsored by a supplier rather than a full-dress manufacturer. Despite the slightly detuned engine, the car still made 270 horsepower, a respectable number for 1972, but another indication of how far muscle car performance had fallen from even a couple of years before. All told, Olds and Hurst only built 629 cars that year, 130 of them convertibles. All cars were attired in cameo white with 3M gold stripes, with the W25 ram air hood standard. Also standard was a turbo hydromatic 400 transmission with console-mounted Hurst dual-gate shifter, gold rally wheels, black strato bucket interior, and special badging. And while Hurst persisted in creating high-performance machines, this car represents a swan song for their tenure as a fairly high-volume manufacturer. Coming up, the last stand of Pontiac.
For Pontiac to come up with a whole new motor, this phenomenal, and then to continue it, so Pontiac kept it together the longest.
Most automobile historians believe Pontiac deserves credit for the rise of the muscle phenomenon. The genre-defining 64 GTO remains one of the most influential cars in American history. But by 1971, the detuning process had already begun, and most of Pontiac's muscle offerings that year were a shadow of their former brute self. The muscle car glory had faded, but for fans, there was a glimmer of hope, a brief Indian summer at the beginning of Detroit's Ice Age. The 1970 GTO Judge is arguably the finest muscle car to bear the Pontiac nameplate, but the next year's model would prove that dark days were coming for the muscle car world.
Now, much to my dismay and to John DeLorean's disgust, the marketing people carried the car over into 1971. It should not have been carried over. It was not a serious enough model, which was a good-looking car, but it didn't have the same image, the same pizzazz.
Each Judge was equipped with the new 455 cubic inch round port HO V8, which output 310 horsepower at 8.4 to 1 compression, a significant step down from the 1970 Judge, which achieved substantially more horsepower from its standard 400 cubic inch Ram Air 3 engine. Only 357 cars were sold before Pontiac mercifully pulled the plug on the Judge in February 1971. A sad end for a legendary car.
This was kind of a shame, because it was a very successful, and is today, a very important part of Pontiac heritage, and particularly GTO heritage.
But not all was gloom and doom at Pontiac. With the decline of traditional muscle cars came a renewed emphasis on pony cars. And the Pontiac Trans Am was about to take a quantum leap, just as its rivals were abandoning the field.
And they brought out a very, very aggressive, sporty-looking new package, which were called the Generation 2 cars. And the Trans Am became kind of the image leader of this whole new generation of Firebird.
The 1971 Pontiac Trans Am took the reins from the GTO as Pontiac's frontline performance car, and it came standard with the biggest engine ever shoehorned into a pony car, a higher horsepower version of the 455 used in the Judge, but this time in a substantially lighter car.
And as the economy kind of adjusted and we were learning how to live better with these low lead and no lead fuels, and Pontiac was able, to their credit, they introduced an engine called the 455 HO, which stood for high output, which was designed right from the drawing board to accommodate 8.75 to 1 compression and new low lead and no lead fuel. And when you put that package in a Trans Am, you had a delightful package.
480 foot-pounds of torque certainly didn't hurt either. This all-original 71 Trans Am also features a hood scoop, an optional 4-speed, and a muted blue paint scheme. It remains one of the most sought-after cars of the era.
and then you hear about it, and then you see it, and then you drive it, and you're like, you've got to have one, you know. They're incredible. They're absolutely phenomenal cars.
By 1973, the Trans Am stood virtually alone as a high-performance muscle car. But a lack of competition didn't mean that the engineers at Pontiac were resting on their laurels. This car features the optional Super Duty 455, the only year that engine was available in the Trans Am. And it's considered by some to be the most powerful engine ever put in an American car.
The compression was only like 9-to-1 or something like that. I mean, it was a pump gas. You can get a 73 Super Duty and fill it up at the pump today. Yeah, so it's all in the heads. I think they have $1 million heads on them or something like that. It's incredible. It's phenomenal. With a stick, you gotta have a stick.
Coming up, the end of an era.
The writing was on the wall. The manufacturers got out as quickly as they could of the muscle car arena. They saw that economy cars were the wave of the future.
Despite the occasional outlier, like the Hurst-Olds pace car or the Super Duty Trans Am, by 1972, the muscle car was officially a thing of the past. But a glorious 8-year run it was since the introduction of the 1964 Pontiac GTO. The period dazzled America with a wide array of high-performance production cars, the likes of which the automotive world had never seen and would never see again. And while the classic muscle car was consigned to the dustbin of history, its high horsepower legacy did not go gently into the night. Muscle cars began as a rebellion against the status quo, a conscious shift towards bigger engines and faster cars, despite the corporate mandates passed down by the CEOs of car companies. They were a way for companies to reach out to their most devoted followers, weekend warriors, and America's youth, by reducing cars to their essence, the raw speed and good looks that people needed to make a splash, running the quarter mile or rolling down the boulevard.
The muscle car was a car that, in some sense, shouldn't have been built. It was unsafe, too fast for the streets and the people that were driving them, extremely rebellious and representing that anti-establishment kind of in-your-face mentality, outrageous in styling. I just feel that it's probably the ultimate rebellious anti-establishment car ever built. And then, of course, the reaction to that was the death of the muscle car. That they're extreme, they're wasteful, they're unsafe, they're detrimental to our environment. Gas guzzlers? I mean, think about it.
All that power proved to be the downfall of muscle cars. Federal environmental regulations, crippling insurance premiums, and significant miscalculations by the Big Three themselves combined to bring the high horsepower era to a swift and sudden end. GM began detuning its cars in 1971, and most of its big blocks would be discontinued by the middle of the decade. 1971 also saw the end of the road for Chrysler's most powerful engines, the Hemi and the 446-pack. Ford had already phased out the 428 Cobra Jet the year before.
And this downward spiral in power outputs accelerated as the 70s wore on. So by 1974, 1975, it's like, power? What power? I don't know what you're talking about. A lot of the cars that had tremendous history, staggering performance, all of a sudden a healthy kid in a 10-speed could embarrass these things. Power outputs were half, sometimes less than half of what they had been a handful of years before. The writing was on the wall. The manufacturers got out as quickly as they could of the muscle car arena. They saw that economy cars were the wave of the future. And we all know how well that came out.
The horsepower wars were over, and the Big Three proceeded to beat their swords into plowshares in anticipation of an age when raw power took a backseat to economy and safety, when big block super predators gave way to the reliability of the Econobox era. But for a brief moment, muscle cars were the bright, shining avatars of American industry, a reminder that cars aren't simply a means for getting from point A to point B. Whether it was a sneaky fast AMC, a Hemi-powered Mopar racer, a stylish GM A-body, or a nimble Ford pony car, muscle cars made driving fun again.
There's one thing about a muscle car is that it never lets you forget that there's a lot of explosions going on right on the other side of that firewall. This is a machine that is, in a way, trying to kill you. And it's a wrestling match between you and the machine. Who's gonna win? You've got to fight for everything you get out of a muscle car. The clutch, the steering, the shifter, the harsh ride, the loud exhaust. It's just an incredible experience that really shakes you down to the very core. That's what muscle cars are all about. Drive them like you stole them. And they'll come back for more. These were big, broad shoulder cars that just made a hell of a statement.
It's been 4 decades since the last true muscle cars rolled off assembly lines. Their legacy lives on thanks to immaculately preserved survivors, meticulously restored originals, and modern muscle car throwbacks. Raw horsepower still exerts a powerful pull on the emotions of enthusiasts worldwide. Muscle cars are reminders of a simpler time, a time when all you needed to be happy was a big engine, a ton of torque, and an open road stretching beyond the horizon. From Day Family Classic Cars in Corona, California, I'm Chip Foose. We'll see you next time on American Icon. In a time of profound social and cultural change, an entire generation of young Americans stood united in their desire for more powerful cars, fueling the greatest horsepower war in automotive history. Screeching rubber through turns, roaring down back streets and country lanes, with fun-loving drivers and their wild and powerful dream machines.